Will there be marriages in the end times, church? It's a bit more complex than it sounds. Now, currently, there is already a great need to distinguish between the secular and governmental definition of marriage and the church definition of marriage. I think that, especially as it's begun in Canada and will strengthen here in movement to consider a biblical definition of marriage to be a form of hate speech. I disagree. God defines marriage, not people. God defines marriage. Human feelings don't. God defines sin. Human feelings don't. But we need a complete separation where we go, fine, the government can have this thing where it issues licenses, but only the church can define what marriage is. And the church says, the Word of God says, a man and a woman covenanting with God. So when the church eventually becomes this renegade underground thing, separate from the government, perhaps hunted by the government, it will certainly have no legally recognized ministry credentials and no capacity to interface with the government to issue marriage licenses. And so you have two choices. One is that churches stop doing marriages of any kind throughout the last days, throughout whenever that shift happens and Christianity is criminalized and becomes an underground spiritual entity, and the second coming, or a return to a much more primitive state where the church itself is the only governing body that recognizes marriages anyway, and so networks of churches can give spiritually binding marital ceremonies. They're not necessarily the piece of paper that the government would issue. Now, I want you to think about that as we thought about the Word of God, Matthew and Romans and Daniel. When God says, for this reason a man should leave his mother and his father and cleave to his wife, talking about marriage, the need for that marital relationship to reflect the union between Christ and his bride, we see marriage as part of God's will. And so when we see the world separating from God's will on that topic, do we then abandon marriage because we need their permission? Or do we then continue in the capacity the church always has? I want you to consider that based on the Word of God as Bereans and reach a conclusion for yourself. These are questions the church will be asking. Whether or not it will be the kind of question when Paul was asking the council at Jerusalem about circumcision. It will be a massive question, a massive division, and the church is going to have to decide upon. Because currently we get to say, it's a piece of paper that defines it. And as long as the civil government is not violating the Word of God and oppressing the church, we need to do that. We need to have the combination of a church community acknowledging and standing with that man and woman, as well as a governmental piece of paper. But when the government becomes a hostile organism to the people of God, are we then in another situation where civil disobedience becomes as valid or relevant as smuggling? If I have blessed you, encouraged you, or equipped you in any fashion, please like and subscribe.